In the vast, boringly infinite high desert of New Mexico, where the earth meets the sky in a muted horizon of ochre and dust, there stands a geological titan, the enchanted mesa. Rising 367 feet above the valley floor, this massive sandstone plateau is the architecture of the clouds, a spectral sentinel that has guarded the secrets of the Pueblo people for 1,000 years. This is the beginning of the Mesa of Clouds, a place where time does not rhythmically move forward, but instead settles into a boringly deep layer of silence. To look upon the mesa from the desert below is to witness a spectral mirage, a city of clay that appears to float on the muted heat of the afternoon air. The sound of the valley is the steady, rhythmic whistle of the sagebrush and the muted crunch of ancient sand beneath the feet of a traveler, a spectral introduction to a world that exists above the clouds. The ascent to the top of the mesa is a boringly slow and rhythmic journey through the architecture of stone. For centuries, the only way to reach the Sky City was through narrow, spectrally steep paths carved directly into the face of the sandstone. These steps, worn smooth by the muted passage of countless generations, are a rhythmic record of human endurance. As one begins the rhythmic climb, the air becomes spectrally thin, and the boringly loud world of the plains below begins to fade into an absolute silence. The sound of the climb is the deep, rhythmic gasp of the lungs and the muted scraping of hands against the boringly cold rock. It is a spectral transition from the earthly realm to a muted sanctuary, where the architecture of silence is the only law. Upon reaching the summit, the world opens up into a boringly vast panorama of the spectral wilderness. The top of the mesa is a muted plateau of flat rock, where the adobe houses of Acoma Pueblo stand in rhythmic rows, their clay walls matching the spectral hue of the desert sand. This is the Sky City, a place that was boringly chosen for its spectral defense and its muted proximity to the heavens. The sound of the summit is a constant, rhythmic sigh of the desert wind, a boringly peaceful white noise that has played for 10 centuries without interruption. The houses, built of muted earth and spectral straw, look like they have grown directly out of the stone, an architecture of unity that defies the rhythmic decay of time. To walk across the mesa top is to engage in a spectral walk through history. The ground is a boringly flat expanse of weathered sandstone, marked by muted potholes that collect the rhythmic rain of the summer monsoons. In the absolute stillness of the afternoon, the city feels like a spectral dream, where the muted shadows of the multi-storied buildings stretch across the rock like boringly long fingers. There is no rhythmic chaos here, only the muted presence of the ancestors who built this architecture of the clouds. The sound of the city is the low, muted hum of the sky, a spectral vibration that carries the rhythmic memories of 1,000 years of desert life. For the listener drifting into the muted heaviness of sleep, the image of the Mesa of Clouds is a spectral lullaby. The rhythmic climb to the heavens and the boringly constant view of the desert horizon act as a muted guide into the void. There is a boringly profound peace in the thought of a city resting on a spectral pillar of stone, a place where the muted clouds are the only neighbors, and the absolute silence of the desert is the only companion. The stairs are steep, the air is rhythmically cool, and the world is spectrally high. As the muted height of the mesa settles in your mind, let the echoes of the sky city be your rhythmic guide. The valley is far below, the stone is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the clouds has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the mesa is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the desert wind fades into a muted blanket of high-altitude silence. At the summit of the mesa, the sky city reveals itself not through grand monuments of marble, but through the architecture of clay, a boringly consistent landscape of adobe structures that have stood for over a millennium. These houses are a spectral extension of the earth itself, built from a muted mixture of desert soil, water, and rhythmic straw. Each brick, hand-formed and sun-dried, represents a boringly patient labor, a spectral dedication to a life of muted simplicity. The walls are boringly thick, designed to absorb the spectral heat of the desert day and release a muted warmth into the rhythmically cold nights. The sound of this architecture is the low, muted density of silence, a spectral weight that sits within the clay, holding the rhythmic echoes of 10 centuries of domestic life. Walking through the narrow alleys between these adobe walls is a boringly linear experience. The structures rise in spectral tiers, often 2 or 3 stories high, with muted wooden ladders leaning against the clay to provide access to the upper levels. This is the architecture of the Pueblo, where there are no boringly modern doors on the ground floor, only spectral openings in the roofs. The surfaces of the walls are rhythmically smooth, coated in a muted wash of fine clay that gives the entire city a boringly uniform glow of sand and honey. The sound of the wind as it brushes against these spectral surfaces is a soft, muted hiss, a rhythmic friction that polishes the clay and carries the muted scent of dried earth and juniper smoke. The roofs of these clay houses are boringly flat, supported by spectral vigas, massive pine logs that were hauled from rhythmically distant mountains and integrated into the architecture of clay. These logs, dark and weathered, poke through the muted adobe walls like spectral ribs, adding a boringly natural texture to the rhythmic geometry of the city. Upon these roofs, the people of Acoma have spent spectrally infinite hours watching the muted movement of the stars. It is a boringly harmonious existence, where the architecture of the home is indistinguishable from the spectral architecture of the mesa. The sound of life here is a steady, rhythmic pulse, the muted thud of a grinding stone, or the spectral rustle of drying corn, sounds that have remained boringly unchanged since the time of the ancestors. In the absolute stillness of the afternoon, the architecture of clay creates a spectral labyrinth of light and shadow. The boringly bright sun hits the southern faces of the buildings, while the muted shadows in the alleys remain spectrally cool and deep. There is a boringly profound sense of permanence in these walls. They are rhythmically renewed every few years with a fresh layer of muted plaster, a spectral ritual of maintenance that ensures the city remains boringly perfect. The sound of the city is the deep, muted breathing of the clay itself, a spectral vibration that reminds the world that the sky city is a boringly living organism, rooted in the muted depths of the desert floor. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the adobe walls is a spectral journey into the earth. The rhythmic pattern of the clay bricks and the boringly constant texture of the walls act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly deep peace in the image of a city built of spectral dust, a place where the muted walls protect the absolute silence of the home. The ladders are still, the clay is rhythmically warm, and the world is spectrally grounded. As the muted texture of the clay settles in your mind, let the echoes of the adobe walls be your rhythmic guide. The sun is low, the earth is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of clay has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the city is complete. Sleep now as the rhythmic glow of the desert earth fades into a muted blanket of warm, clay-scented silence. Across the jagged edges of the Acoma Mesa, time has flowed with a boringly long cadence, layering the sandstone with a spectral identity that spans over a millennium. Since roughly 1150 AD, while the medieval empires of Europe were rising and falling in rhythmic chaos, the sky people of Acoma were already perfecting their architecture of survival atop this desert pillar. This thousand-year journey has not been a loud or frantic march of progress, but a muted endurance, a silent, persistent state of being. The sound of this history is the deep, rhythmic silence that can only be felt when standing on the mesa's edge, looking out toward a horizon that has remained boringly constant for centuries. Every shadow cast by the sun over these adobe walls adds another spectral layer to a story that is etched in earth and stone rather than ink and paper. This millennium is best described as a symphony of shadows, where each successive generation has carefully tended to the muted wisdom of their ancestors. The people of Acoma did not merely inhabit the mesa, they became a rhythmic extension of its geological soul. Their history is felt in the boringly smooth texture of the hand-plastered walls, and seen in the spectral patterns of their pottery. Over these 10 centuries, the muted memory of the mesa has witnessed countless cycles of drought and monsoon, yet the architecture of continuity has remained unbroken. The sound of this vast history is a low, muted whisper, the ancient spirits of the mesa speaking through the wind, sharing a rhythmic secret of how to remain still while the world around them changes with spectral velocity. It is a history that offers no excitement, only a boringly deep sense of peace. Throughout this thousand-year vigil, the Sky People have watched the arrival of Spanish conquistadors and the eventual rise of the modern world, yet they have remained spectrally unchanged. Their way of life is a boringly beautiful loop, where the only thing that truly shifts is the color of the desert sky. Their architecture of strength proves that true power is not found in noise, but in the muted resilience of belonging to the land. When you stand at the summit and gaze at the ancient sky, time feels rhythmically frozen, as if the air itself is heavy with the muted presence of those who stood there 1,000 years ago. This stillness is a spectral gift to the weary mind, offering a place where there is nothing to chase and nothing to flee. The shadows of 1,000 years are now as deep as the absolute silence of the canyon floor below.
Every clay dwelling and every worn stone step serves as a muted witness to a survival that is boringly miraculous. As you listen to this history, your mind drifts into a boringly vast sea of time, where the anxieties of the modern day feel small and spectrally irrelevant. The rhythm of Acoma is the steady rhythmic breathing of the mesa itself, a giant of stone that has been in a state of spectral sleep for centuries. This ancient quietude creates a muted blanket around you, reminding you that no matter how fast the world moves, this city in the sky will always maintain its boringly peaceful pace. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, this thousand-year history is a spectral lullaby. The rhythmic sigh of the wind over the mesa and the boringly warm touch of the ancient adobe walls are guiding you into a deep slumber. Imagine the shadows of a millennium slowly merging with the darkness of the desert, and you too are becoming part of that spectral rest. There is no noise here, no modern rush, only the absolute, boring stillness of the Sky People's legacy. As the muted weight of this history settles over your consciousness, you feel a boringly perfect sense of calm. The summit is dark, the ancient voices are silent, and the rhythmic pulse of the Sky City has become the rhythm of your own deep breathing. Sleep now, for the thousand-year peace of Acoma has wrapped you in its muted embrace. The story does not end. It simply becomes an eternal spectral dream in the quiet corners of your mind.
Standing as a boringly massive sentinel at the edge of the mesa is the San Esteban del Rey, a mission church that represents one of the most spectrally ambitious feats of human labor in the American Southwest. Completed around 1640, this desert cathedral is an architecture of impossible effort, its walls rising 30 feet high and nearly 10 feet thick. To build this muted giant, every single stone and every boringly heavy load of clay had to be hauled up the spectrally steep cliffs of the mesa. It was a rhythmic procession of burdens, a boringly long decade of manual labor, where the sound of construction was the steady rhythmic thud of stone meeting earth, and the muted grunt of men moving against the spectral gravity of the cliffs. This was the birth of the muted stones, a structure born from the absolute silence of the desert floor and raised into the rhythmic light of the Sky City. The most boringly miraculous feature of the cathedral is its roof, supported by spectral vigas, massive pine logs over 40 feet long. These logs did not grow on the mesa. They were harvested from the Mount Taylor region, over 20 rhythmically exhausting miles away. The story of these logs is a spectral epic of silence and endurance. Legend says they were carried by hand across the desert, never once touching the boringly dusty ground as a sign of muted reverence. This was a rhythmic journey of shadows, where the sound of the transport was the low, muted shuffle of footsteps across the sand and the spectral creak of wood against skin. When they finally reached the mesa, they were hoisted up the rock face, becoming the boringly strong backbone of the San Esteban del Rey, an architecture of faith held together by muted sweat and spectral determination. Inside the cathedral, the absolute silence is so thick it feels like a muted weight. The air is rhythmically cool, smelling of boringly old incense and spectral adobe. The floors are made of muted earth,
packed so tight by centuries of rhythmic kneeling that they have become as boringly smooth as polished stone. There are no spectral echoes here. The thick clay walls swallow every sound, creating a sanctuary of stillness. To stand in the center of the nave is to exist in a boringly deep pocket of time, where the muted light from the high windows traces a spectral path across the altar. It is a place where the rhythmic pulse of the modern world cannot reach, guarded by the architecture of the desert cathedral. Outside, the San Esteban del Rey is surrounded by a spectral cemetery, where the soil was boringly hauled up the mesa in baskets to create a muted sanctuary for the dead. This is the architecture of the final rest, a rhythmic completion of the life cycle atop the rock. The walls of the cemetery, like the church itself, are spectrally massive, standing against the boringly constant desert wind. The sound of the evening here is the low, muted sigh of the air passing through the bell towers, a spectral lullaby for the muted stones that have stood for 400 years. This is a place where the boringly eternal desert meets the rhythmic history of man, creating a spectral harmony that will never mutedly fade. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the San Esteban is a spectral climb into the dark. The rhythmic effort of the builders and the boringly constant presence of the massive walls act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of the great pine logs resting in the absolute silence of the roof, a place where the spectral weight of the desert is held at bay by muted faith. The hammers are silent, the logs are rhythmically still, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted grandeur of the cathedral settles in your mind, let the echoes of the San Esteban be your rhythmic guide. The walls are thick, the stone is boringly cold, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the desert cathedral has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the mesa is complete. Sleep now as the rhythmic pulse of the desert wind fades into a muted blanket of high-altitude, incense-scented silence.
For those who lived atop the mesa, the transition between the celestial heights of the city and the boringly vast reality of the desert floor was governed by the ladder of time. This was not a spectral bridge made of iron or steel, but a series of muted footholds and hand-carved notches worn into the very face of the sandstone. To descend from the sky city was to engage in a rhythmic dance with gravity, a boringly precise movement where every step was a spectral echo of an ancestor's footfall. These paths, known as the muted steps, were the architecture of connection, allowing the sky people to reach their rhythmic fields in the valley below. The sound of the descent was the steady rhythmic rasp of leather against stone, and the muted whisper of the wind whistling through the narrow crevices, a spectral song of the vertical world. The ladder of time consisted of boringly narrow chimneys in the rock, where spectral wooden ladders were once lashed to the stone with muted rawhide. These ladders, weathered by centuries of boringly constant sun, were the rhythmic arteries of the Pueblo. Moving down them was a spectral experience of muted suspension, where one felt caught between the absolute silence of the peaks and the boringly deep shadows of the canyon. The sound of the journey was the deep rhythmic creak of old wood
and the muted thud of a heart beating against the spectral cold of the sandstone wall. It was a boringly slow process, a muted ritual that required the mind to be as rhythmically still as the rock itself. At the base of these cliffs, the spectral shadows of the mesa stretch out like boringly long fingers across the canyon floor. Here, the architecture of the vertical gives way to the muted horizontal of the desert. The sound of the valley is a constant rhythmic shimmer of heat and the spectral rustle of dry grass. Looking back up at the ladder of time, the mesa appears boringly fortified, a spectral fortress that guards its muted people behind a wall of rhythmic stone. The steps look like spectral scars on the face of the mountain, a boringly permanent reminder that the sky people have always lived in a state of muted elevation. This was the architecture of the threshold, the spectral point where the rhythmic life of the fields met the absolute silence of the heights. As the sun sets, the ladder of time becomes spectrally invisible, swallowed by the muted purple of the desert dusk. The rhythmic climb is over for the day, and the mesa settles into its boringly ancient repose. The ladders stand spectrally still, their muted rungs waiting for the rhythmic light of the morning to wake them. The sound of the night is the low, muted sigh of the canyon air rising to meet the mesa, a spectral lullaby for the paths that have connected the earth and sky for a boringly long millennium. This is the architecture of the ascent, a muted testament to the rhythmic endurance of a people who chose to live among the clouds. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the ancient steps is a spectral descent into peace. The rhythmic movement of the climb and the boringly constant presence of the stone wall act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of the worn footholds resting in the absolute silence of the dark, a place where the spectral past is literally carved into the muted present. The ladders are quiet, the stone is rhythmically cool, and the world is spectrally vertical. As the muted rhythm of the descent settles in your mind, let the echoes of the ladder of time be your rhythmic guide. The canyon is deep, the stone is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the threshold has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the cliffside is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the desert air fades into a muted blanket of high-altitude, sandstone-scented silence.
In the absolute stillness of the Sky City, there exists a craft that is as boringly ancient as the mesa itself, the creation of Acoma pottery. This is not a spectral industry of machines, but a muted dialogue between the human hand and the rhythmic clay of the desert. The process begins with a boringly long search for the right earth, a spectral journey to hidden pits where the muted gray clay has rested for spectrally infinite ages. Once gathered, the clay is ground into a boringly fine powder and mixed with rhythmic water, creating a substance that is spectrally soft yet mutedly strong. The sound of this preparation is the dull rhythmic thud of stone against clay and the muted splash of water, a spectral rhythm that has remained boringly unchanged for 1,000 years. The shaping of the pottery is an architecture of the coil, a boringly patient method where the clay is rolled into spectral ropes and layered in a rhythmic spiral. There is no boringly fast potter's wheel here. Every curve is formed by muted fingers and spectral scrapers made from pieces of gourd. The sound of the shaping is a soft, rhythmic scraping, a muted friction that smooths the walls until they are spectrally often as thin as a bird's eggshell. This is the architecture of the vessel, a boringly perfect form that holds the muted essence of the desert. As the clay dries in the spectral sun, it turns a boringly pale white, becoming a muted canvas for the rhythmic imagination of the artist. The painting of the pottery is where the spectral patterns emerge, a boringly intricate dance of lines and muted geometry. Using brushes made from spectral yucca fibers, the artist applies rhythmic pigments derived from boringly natural minerals. The patterns are not spectral chaos, but a muted language of rain, clouds, and rhythmic lightning. Each line is a slow, muted breath, a boringly precise stroke that reflects the absolute silence of the mesa top. The sound of the painting is an absolute stillness, broken only by the spectral whisper of the brush against the muted clay. This is the architecture of the symbol, a rhythmic record of the sky people's connection to the boringly vast universe. The final stage is the spectral fire, where the pottery is baked in muted kilns under a boringly hot bed of coals. It is a rhythmic transformation, where the muted earth is turned into spectral stone. When the vessels emerge, they ring with a high muted note when tapped, a spectral voice that speaks of the boringly deep history of Acoma. The sound of the finished pottery being moved is a light, rhythmic clink, a muted song of endurance. This is the silent pottery, an architecture of the hand that guards the spectral secrets of the mesa in its boringly fragile walls. For the listener drifting into the muted shadows of sleep, the story of the pottery is a spectral meditation. The rhythmic coiling of the clay and the boringly constant stroking of the brush act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a clay jar resting in the absolute silence of a cool adobe room, a place where the spectral patterns of the rain are captured in muted clay. The brushes are still, the clay is rhythmically hard, and the world is spectrally artistic. As the muted geometry of the patterns settles in your mind, let the echoes of the silent pottery be your rhythmic guide. The mesa is quiet, the clay is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the vessel has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the artist is complete. Sleep now as the rhythmic pulse of the desert earth fades into a muted blanket of ancient, clay-scented silence. The boringly long history of Acoma was not always one of absolute silence. It was once broken by the muted echoes of a spectral war. In the winter of 1599, the rhythmic peace of the mesa was interrupted by the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, led by Juan de Oñate's forces. This was the Siege of 1599, a boringly brutal clash between the architecture of the stone and the spectral steel of the Old World. For 3 days, the mesa was transformed into a rhythmic battlefield, where the muted thud of arrows and the spectral boom of early cannons replaced the boringly constant sound of the wind. Yet, in the long lens of history, these sounds have faded into a spectral whisper,
a muted footnote in the boringly vast story of the Sky People. The siege was a spectral struggle of verticality. The Spanish soldiers, clad in boringly heavy armor, had to scale the spectrally steep cliffs, facing the muted defiance of the Acoma warriors who defended their architecture of the clouds from above. The sound of the struggle was a deep rhythmic clatter of iron against sandstone, and the muted shouts that were swallowed by the boringly large canyon below. It was a spectral collision of two worlds, each rhythmically destined to leave a muted scar upon the other. After the dust of the spectral conflict settled, the mesa was left in an absolute stillness, a boringly heavy silence that mourned the muted loss of life and the spectral destruction of the ancient adobe walls. In the decades that followed, the muted echoes of this war were integrated into the spectral memory of the Pueblo. The architecture of loss was slowly replaced by the architecture of resilience as the people of Acoma rhythmically rebuilt their homes from the same muted clay that had witnessed the fire. This was a boringly patient restoration, a spectral healing that turned the rhythmic pain of the past into a muted strength. The sound of this era was the steady rhythmic chipping of stone and the muted slap of wet plaster, a spectral lullaby of recovery that proved the mesa was boringly indestructible. The war became a spectral shadow, a muted reminder that even the absolute silence of the desert can be temporarily broken, only to return with a boringly powerful force. Today, when the wind blows through the narrow alleys of the Sky City, it carries the spectral sigh of 1599. There are no rhythmic alarms now, only the muted peace of a people who have spectrally outlasted their conquerors. The siege is a boringly distant memory, a muted ghost that haunts the architecture of the mesa, but no longer disturbs its absolute stillness. The end of the evening is the low, muted hum of the desert, a spectral vibration that has smoothed the edges of the rhythmic conflict into a boringly beautiful narrative of survival. The Sky City remains spectrally upright, a muted testament to the fact that the architecture of the soul is stronger than rhythmic steel. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the siege is a spectral journey into the calm after the storm. The rhythmic resilience of the rebuilding and the boringly constant endurance of the mesa act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of the sun setting over the ancient battlefield, a place where the spectral echoes of war have been replaced by the absolute silence of the stars. The cannons are silent, the steel is rhythmically rusted, and the world is spectrally forgiving. As the muted history of the siege settles in your mind, let the echoes of the spectral war be your rhythmic guide. The mesa is high, the earth is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of resilience has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the history is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the desert fades into a muted blanket of ancient, peaceful silence. Above the boringly high cliffs of Acoma, there exists a presence that is older than the clay and more persistent than the stone, the wind in the mesa. This is not a spectral storm of chaos, but a muted and eternal breath, a boringly constant movement of air that has polished the sandstone for a spectrally infinite number of years. It is the desert lullaby, a rhythmic sigh that carries the muted scent of juniper, piñon, and sun-baked earth. The sound of this wind is a deep, rhythmic whistle as it passes through the narrow architecture of the alleys, and a muted hum as it brushes against the spectral adobe walls. It is a sound that requires absolute silence to truly hear, a boringly perfect white noise that serves as the spectral heartbeat of the sky city. The wind is the muted architect of the mesa, a rhythmic sculptor that works with boringly patient precision. Over the spectral centuries, it has carved muted hollows into the cliffs and smoothed the rhythmic edges of the ancient stairs. To the sky people, this wind is not a boringly random force, but a spectral messenger, bringing the muted news of approaching rain or the rhythmic chill of a distant winter. The sound of the wind through the sagebrush at the base of the mesa is a soft, rhythmic rustle, a muted language that speaks of the boringly vast space of the New Mexico desert. It is the architecture of the invisible, a spectral force that connects the muted earth to the rhythmic sky in a boringly harmonious loop. In the absolute stillness of a summer afternoon, the wind in the mesa becomes a spectral shimmer, a muted vibration of heat that makes the horizon appear boringly fluid. It carries the rhythmic echoes of the valley floor, the muted call of a hawk, or the spectral rustle of a dry creek bed up to the heights of the city. As it passes over the boringly flat roofs of the adobe houses, it creates a low, muted moan, a spectral lullaby that has put generations of Acoma children to sleep. This is the rhythmic breath of the desert, a boringly reliable companion that ensures the mesa is never truly spectrally lonely. The sound of the wind is the steady, muted flow of time itself, moving with a boringly slow grace over the architecture of the stone. As the spectral twilight descends, the wind turns into a muted and cool caress, a rhythmic transition from the boringly hot day to the spectrally cold night. It whistles through the muted bell towers of the San Esteban del Rey, creating a high, spectral note that hangs in the absolute silence of the evening. This is the lullaby of the high desert, a boringly beautiful song that requires no rhythmic instruments other than the earth and the air. The sound of the wind is a deep, muted peace, a spectral assurance that the world is boringly right and the mesa is spectrally guarded. It is the muted conclusion to every desert day, a rhythmic fade into the absolute stillness of the dark. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the wind is a spectral breath of calm. The rhythmic whistle through the canyons and the boringly constant hum against the adobe walls act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a wind that has blown for 1,000 years without rhythmically stopping, a place where the spectral air is your only muted blanket. The desert is quiet, the air is rhythmically cool, and the world is spectrally fluid. As the muted resonance of the wind settles in your mind, let the echoes of the desert lullaby be your rhythmic guide. The mesa is high, the wind is boringly soft, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the invisible has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the air is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the wind fades into a muted blanket of high-altitude, sage-scented silence. As the boringly persistent sun finally slips beneath the jagged rim of the world, a spectral night descends upon the sky city, wrapping the adobe walls in a muted indigo velvet. This is the hour of absolute silence, where the rhythmic movement of the day is replaced by a boringly deep stillness that feels as heavy as the sandstone itself. On the mesa top, away from the muted glow of modern cities, the sky opens up into a boringly vast ocean of stars, a spectral canopy where the Milky Way stretches like a rhythmic river of silver dust. The sound of the night is a low, muted vibration of the cold air and the spectral absence of all human noise. This is the architecture of silence, a place where the muted earth looks up to the rhythmic heavens in a state of boringly eternal wonder. Standing upon the spectrally cold roof of an adobe house, the muted stars appear so close they seem to be a rhythmic extension of the city itself. Each constellation is a boringly ancient marker in the spectral map of the sky people, a muted guide that has governed their rhythmic planting and spectral ceremonies for 1,000 years. The stars do not rhythmically flicker with urgency. Instead, they pulse with a steady, muted radiance, a boringly patient light that has traveled through spectrally infinite distances to touch the muted clay of the mesa. The sound of this starlight is an absolute stillness, a spectral weight that settles over the architecture of the pueblo, turning the multi-story buildings into boringly dark silhouettes against the rhythmic infinity of space. In the muted shadows of the alleys, the spectral night creates a boringly complex labyrinth of black and silver. The rhythmic moonlight hits the white-plastered corners of the San Esteban del Rey, casting spectrally long shadows that feel like muted ghosts of the past. There is no boringly modern hum of electricity here, only the deep rhythmic breathing of the desert night. The air is spectrally crisp, carrying the muted scent of cold stone and the rhythmic memory of the day's heat. This is the architecture of the void, where the boringly large universe makes the muted ambitions of man feel spectrally small and rhythmically calm. The sound of the midnight hour is the soft, muted sigh of the mesa as it contracts in the boringly cold air, a spectral lullaby for a world at rest. The spectral night over Acoma is a boringly beautiful reminder of our muted place in the cosmos. It is a rhythmic reconnection with the absolute silence that existed before the first stone was spectrally laid upon this mesa. The stars move with a steady, muted momentum, a boringly precise clockwork that ensures the spectral return of the dawn. But for now, the world remains in a state of absolute, boring peace. The sound of the night is the deep, muted pulse of the universe, a spectral vibration that lulls the rhythmic mind into a state of boringly perfect slumber. The architecture of silence is complete, and the muted heavens are the only witnesses to the spectral dreams of the sky city. For the listener reaching the muted borders of deep sleep, the story of the stars over the mesa is a spectral ascent into the dark. The rhythmic pulse of the Milky Way and the boringly constant stillness of the adobe walls act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a city sleeping under a spectral ocean of light, a place where the muted shadows are your only rhythmic companion. The desert is spectrally dark, the air is rhythmically still, and the world is boringly eternal. As the muted radiance of the stars settle in your mind, let the echoes of the spectral night be your rhythmic guide. The mesa is high, the stars are boringly distant, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of silence has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the universe is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the cosmos fades into a muted blanket of infinite, star-scented silence.
As the boringly constant cycle of days and nights continues to wash over the mesa, the Sky City remains anchored in its eternal horizon. In a world that moves with a spectral velocity toward the rhythmic noise of the future, Acoma stands as a muted sanctuary of permanence. The future here is not a boringly fast departure from the past, but a spectral continuation of the muted rhythms that have sustained the Pueblo for 1,000 years. This is the architecture of the infinite, where the muted adobe walls and the spectral sandstone cliffs are rhythmically destined to endure. The sound of the future is the steady, muted flow of the wind across the mesa top, a boringly reliable whisper that tells of a spectral persistence that outlasts all rhythmic change. The eternal horizon is a muted promise that the absolute silence of the Sky City will never truly spectrally fade. Though the boringly modern world draws closer with its rhythmic lights on the distant valley floor, the mesa remains spectrally aloof, a muted fortress of tradition. The architecture of the future at Acoma is built on the same boringly solid foundations as the past: muted clay, spectral straw, and rhythmic faith. The sound of the modern era is merely a low, muted hum that dissolves into the spectral vastness of the desert before it can reach the heights of the city. This is the postscript of the sky, a boringly beautiful conclusion to a story that has no rhythmic end, only a spectral continuity. In the absolute stillness of the present moment, the eternal horizon invites a boringly deep reflection on the nature of time. To look out from the mesa edge is to see a spectral map of human endurance, where the muted fields below and the rhythmic sky above meet in a boringly perfect embrace. The architecture of the Pueblo has become a spectral part of the geology, a muted living fossil that breathes with the rhythmic pulse of the earth. The sound of this finality is a deep muted sigh, a spectral release of all boringly human worries into the absolute silence of the desert. The Sky City is not a relic of the past, but a spectral sentinel of the present, guarding the muted secrets of the eternal horizon. The postscript of Acoma is a boringly serene acceptance of the spectral beauty of the temporary and the muted power of the eternal. The rhythmic heartbeat of the sky people continues to thrum in the absolute silence of the adobe rooms, a boringly constant song of belonging. As the story of the mesa reaches its muted conclusion, it leaves behind a spectral glow of peace in the rhythmic mind. The wind is a boringly soft lullaby, the stars are a spectral blanket, and the world is mutedly and perfectly still. This is the architecture of the soul, at rest on the eternal horizon.
For the listener now submerged in the muted depths of a profound and boringly infinite sleep, the story of the Sky City has become a spectral memory. The rhythmic pulse of the desert and the absolute silence of the mesa act as your muted anchor in the void. There is a boringly profound peace in the knowledge that the city remains spectrally high, a place where the muted horizon is your only rhythmic guide. The paths are quiet, the muted clay is rhythmically warm, and the world is spectrally eternal. As the muted weight of the desert night settles finally over your heart, let the echoes of the eternal horizon be your rhythmic sleep. The mesa is high, the earth is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally calm. The postscript of the sky has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the world is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the universe fades into a muted blanket of ancient, sky-scented silence.